So, for the next fireside chat, I am delighted to introduce Thando Hopa, who is, take a deep breath now, an international model and a lawyer, an activist and an actress, and a big advocate for diversity, which is one of the many reasons she's here with us today. Thando is a master of challenging the way things are, and I'm pretty sure that we are all gathered here together to try and do that ourselves. So if Thando would like to come onto the stage, and if we can all give her a big hand. This is so great. I only ever want to go to events where there's a band introducing everyone. So Thando, we have, I think, about 300 women and men here today who are building and investing in tech that could and hopefully will shape our societies for the better. Lots of these women are running companies, they're responsible for big amounts of money and lots of people's jobs. And so I think if change can come from anywhere, it can come from here. So I'm hoping you can give us some inspiration and advice today. So Thando, you started out as a lawyer. How did you begin challenging the status quo and becoming the activist that you are today?
Dumelang Sanbonani, bonjour. My French is pedestrian, but I try. So in terms of talking about challenging the status quo, I think that, when I started actually being a lawyer, being a prosecutor, that is, I don't think I really saw my work as challenging the status quo, because at the time, I was somewhat an administrator of justice. I'm so sorry, but the echo is so distracting. But I was an administrator of justice. I was an implementer, an executor of justice. And I think that I felt like the work that I do already is for the good of society, but I never saw my work in the framework of reconstruction and, but when I moved into media, I think then I really had the consciousness of seeing my work through the lens of activism, and I think that's when I started challenging the status quo, because, I think actually anybody can be an activist in the work that they do, whether you are an engineer, you're in tech, etc. Because I think activism is a character trait for your work. It characterizes how you pursue the work that you do. And I think that lens and the character trait of activism really came in when I went into media, because in media I saw culture as a negotiating instrument, because that was the place where people who had bodies like mine or bodies that were marginalized, that's where you can use the body as an instrument of perception to create and negotiate different ideas into society.
And how do you think the people here can tap into their inner activist? What do you need to do to unleash the activist inside you?
I think the work of activism is the work of imagination. You have to be creative and you have to be imaginative, because first of all, you have to use the resources that you have, which are limited. And you have to find a way of imagining this world that people cannot see yet. And you use the tools and resources in the present to help people see a world that they cannot imagine yet. So that's why I'm saying that it's the work of imagination, because you have to build these resources to say, equity, equality, people don't see that yet. And activists do see that, so they use their resources to invest in this future that people cannot even imagine yet.
And you, I should have said in my introduction, you have contributed to the United Nations policy discussions on albinism, and you're one of the founding delegates of the Global Albinism Alliance. I'm imagining there are lots of situations where you're trying to get people to listen to that or other issues that you are passionate about, especially, and we've all been there when we're trying to get people to care about diversity. And you're at a tech conference, and the panel on diversity comes, and everyone leaves. Or the people who come in are just the people who you see at every conference that cares about diversity. How do you get people to listen whose ears are closed?
You know, when you're moving into a process of trying to get people to listen, I would say, first of all, try to limit the exposure where you cannot be in keeping with your own truth. Because I know that our circumstances are contextual. Negotiations are contextual, they're fluid. Bargaining power changes depending on the context and the situation. But try to be in keeping with situations that don't make you deviate from your own truth. And I would place that as a foundational element just for you to be your own, to have an internal locus of control. But that being said, I think, again, going back to negotiations being contextual, communication has to be adaptive. You have to have an adaptive level of communication and contextual intelligence, because what works in one situation may not necessarily work for another situation. So I'll give you an example. I mean, I don't know if what I'm going to say is controversial, but, you know, working in DE&I, the language of diversity and inclusion is generally softer language. And there's a time and there's a place for that. Because when you talk about diversity and inclusion, you're basically inviting mostly institutions that are more powerful than you. You're inviting them to do good. So there's an undertone of social welfare. But it's softer language, and there is definitely a place for that. And then there's harder language, language that is slightly more confrontational. The language of equality, the language of equity, that's relational. It's not an invitation to do good. It is talking about accountability and reform. Basically, you are doing a societal audit on what your policies are, what your legislation is, what is it in the structure that allows certain groups to have unfair advantages while other groups have unfair disadvantages. So that language, there's a time and place for that, but you have to be adaptive, because that's a more difficult and uncomfortable discussion, you know. So I think one thing that you learn, and you will learn it really through experience. You learn context through experience. And then you know which language to use in which context. And the second thing I would say is the optics of negotiation. And I say the optics because you wanna lean and affirm your network and your tribe when you're going into a negotiation. In other words, a more powerful construct needs to feel like you're not standing there alone. You may be standing there alone, but affirm the we that is behind you. And I think one of the examples of this is actually SISTA in itself. You affirm your alliance, you affirm your network. The fact that SISTA already exists, it's a form of soft power for women who are going out there to negotiate. Because they are saying that just by their existence, even if you are a member or an affiliate or somehow you are aligned to SISTA, when you go and negotiate, you're saying, I negotiated as myself, but I do not stand alone. And that basically increases or props up your bargaining power without you even saying anything. The third thing is, there's something called interest convergence, and I don't know if you've done law or critical race theory, and whether you agree with critical race theory or not, if you're looking at disability rights activism, feminism, etc., they give you a framework, an analytical framework to approach a situation. And in critical race theory, there's this concept called interest convergence. Basically, you find a place and a situation or values where you are aligned, and it's somewhat a win-win situation scenario. And I don't want to over-glorify win-win situations, because there are times, especially when you're looking at social justice, where win-win is not particularly a realizable thing. Because win-win, it sounds painless. You know, we can go into negotiations and we don't really, there's a pain avoidance about it. But when you're looking at social justice, something has got to give. But going back to interest convergence, there is, and okay, because I'm a lawyer, I will generally go back to some kind of legal example. Oh, actually, I was a lawyer. I'm no longer a lawyer now. I am fully a model. But there is this term, sexual orientation. And South Africa was one of the first countries to actually place sexual orientation as a prohibited ground. But how did that happen? Simon Nkoli, who was a gay black political activist, he lobbied for the term sexual orientation because people were looking at prohibited grounds of unfair discrimination, age, race, gender, sex, etc. And he could have bargained or lobbied for homosexuality, but he needed buy-in. He needed more people to be in solidarity with his idea. And sexual orientation became that human-inspired right, because if you say you cannot discriminate against me based on my sexual orientation, I also am there as a heterosexual woman. People who are polygamous and polyandrous, I know that's a bit controversial, but they are also there, you know? So he was having a human-inspired phrase so that more people have solidarity with his idea. So as much as it was protecting him as a gay man, but it was also bringing a whole host of other people to the table. So, yes.
I love this idea of being very conscious about the language you use when you go into those discussions, whether it's with an LP or a VC, and knowing whether you need to be, I'm your equal, or I come with this big group behind me and I am not alone. And also thinking about, with the example you just gave, whether, you know, who you can include in the language you use to therefore get more of perhaps your own way. If you've done all that preparation, you go into battle, it doesn't go the way, how do you bounce back? How do you continue to fight the good fight when it feels, you know, we saw the stats earlier. Every single year, it's like, oh, 0.000% of funding goes to women. It's like, great, it's the same again. My team back in London is writing the headlines, and I'm like, we can't have that headline. It was the same as last year. How do you keep going?
You know, I have to admit, and maybe just have a little bit of vulnerability here, because this question was so triggering for me, because I have had several situations where I did not win a battle, and even a recent one. And that can somewhat dull all the times when you have won these battles. But what I'm about to tell you is literally the process that has helped me and that helps me still. The first is the power of the words "not yet." I have not won this battle yet. I have lost this battle for now. I think it's important for us to remember the temporariness of a situation. You have to have foresight and longevity, because we need to be present in these spaces in order to amass critical mass. Change and progression will not happen in our absence, so we need to find more tools of resilience to stay in spaces that are hostile towards us, so that we can get more people who are like us, whether it's women or marginalized groups, etc., to be in decision-making roles in spaces that never even thought we would exist in them. So the first thing is the power of not yet. And then it goes back to resilience affirming tools. And for me, you know, they say time heals all things. I think perspective heals most things. So I go back to my tribe, I go back to my network when I have been wounded. When I go into battle and I go there and I am wounded, I go to a place where I can sit down. And the thing is, you know, a lot of the times when you go into battle and you're wounded and things are just not working out the way you wanted them to work out, or everything is just going downhill, there's a storm, there's this internal storm inside you. And when there's a storm inside you, this is the time you think, you know what, I want to steer this ship right now. I want to give this ship direction right now. But the wind is blowing all over the place. The rains are heavy. It would really help to allow yourself to weather the storm, to calm down. Let the storm calm down. When it is clearer, then you will be able to actually find your direction. And when I calm down, I go to my tribe. I say, this is what has happened. I consult, and they help me look at the very same situation when I was going through chaos they help me look at the same situation in a way where I am empowered and I can progress and I can go on. And the people who are in your tribe are either people who are in your industry and people who are also not in your industry. So I would say really network, affirm, and connect yourself to a larger tribe so that you can keep going. And I think, another thing is, for me, at least I'll explain for myself, is that when I go into battle, I have to come back to the present. I have to remind my body to come back to the present because, and I know that this all sounds very wishy-washy, but when you have lost a battle on something that's really important to you, you've gone in and the bargaining power has really kind of thrown you off. And what I experience is two things: anxiety or trauma. And this is when you lose something where it's really important to you. You have to remind your body to be here in the present. You have to tell it, we are still here right now. Because trauma makes you look back, and anxiety makes you worry about the future. And you always have to kind of bring yourself back into the present to say, I am here right now, and I can go on. Once you calm yourself down and the body down, then you do an audit or a post-mortem. What happened in this particular situation? You go back, you sit with your team, but now you have perspective. And now you can unpack and improve your systems. That's the reason why it's important. In my network, I'll have an engineer who's very close to me. I will have an activist who's very close to me. All of these tools help you unpack your systems and your loopholes and build better systems.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Thando.
Thank you.